Good evening and welcome to the Environmental Film Festival of Australia and their Out of This World programme of online events. My name is Dartnell. I'm a professor at the University of Westminster in London, and the field of my research, my science, is called astrobiology. It's all about looking into the possibility of there being life beyond the Earth. I spend most of my time thinking about our next door neighbour planet, Mars, and whether there could be ultra-hardy bacteria surviving in the surface, or what are the best ways of detecting if that life might be there, and other aspects of how humans might come to settle and colonise Mars in the near future. So there's a great deal of overlap between my science research and several of the films in this festival, such as Spaceship Earth and On the Other Side of Mars, which personally I'm very much looking forward to seeing. But what I wanted to talk to you about tonight is on something completely different. The topic of my last book, The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch, starts with a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that this has actually happened. There's been some kind of global catastrophe, a doomsday event, an apocalypse. And civilization as we know it has collapsed, and the vast majority of the human race has disappeared. But let's say that for the sake of this thought experiment, that myself and you as an audience have survived the end of the world. You've been protected in some kind of hardened bunker, and we walk outside in an hour or so, blinking in the bright lights of a post-apocalyptic world, stood amongst the smouldering ruins of the cities around us. And the question that will be on all of our lips at this point is, what now? How could you go about recovering as quickly as possible? Could you rebuild society for ourselves from the ground up? Could you reboot civilization itself in the way you would reboot a computer after it's crashed? How could you navigate a shortcut route through this great network of scientific discoveries and technological inventions that enabled us to build the world in the first place? What single book, a handbook, would you want given to you that explained all of the most useful information and knowledge through history of how to build a comfortable society for yourself? Well, this is the book that I've tried to write as a scientist. And I hope it should be clear now that I'm not some kind of survivalist or doomsday prepper. I don't genuinely believe the world is about to end. There is currently a global pandemic, but even coronavirus is not nearly as severe or catastrophic to trigger an end of civilization event. So what I'm talking about in this thought experiment is, how could you do this for real? Could you do Minecraft for real? Could you start in the middle of a blank, empty landscape and know where to go to collect all the raw materials and substances out of the natural environment around you that you need to make particular tools or make particular technologies, maybe using things in different combinations of each other to pull yourself back up by your own bootstraps and reboot a civilization for you after some kind of apocalypse? So let's start in this immediate aftermath of our hypothetical apocalypse. And one of the top things on your survival to-do list is going to be, where can I get food from? Not just, I'm getting a bit peckish, it's lunchtime, but how do I stop myself from starving to death in this post-apocalyptic wasteland? Well, you could still head to your nearest supermarket and scavenge and forage what you need, at least for the time being. Now, as a scientist, I wanted to work out the answer to another thought experiment. Let's imagine I were to take one of you, throw you into an abandoned supermarket and lock the door and throw away the key. How long do you think you could survive for before you'd either eaten all of the food on the shelves of the supermarket or it had gone off before you could get round to eating it? Well, to calculate the answer to this, I went to an average supermarket, one nearby me in North London, and walked up and down every aisle with pen and paper, getting some very odd looks from everyone else there trying to do their weekly grocery shop, and counted all of the edible stuff that was there, or the dried pasta, or the dried rice, or the canned food, multiplied all of that together, and then divided it by the amount you would need to eat per day to survive. And the answer comes out that a single supermarket could keep one person alive for 55 years. Or 63 years if you're happy to eat all the canned dog food and cat food as well. Now, clearly, this is a frivolous example. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the reason all of us living today in the modern, developed world, we no longer fear the coming of famine or the coming of winter and starving to death, because we've worked out how to apply our understanding to stop food going off, how to stop bacteria or mold from eating food before a person is ready to eat it. We invented drying, smoking, the canning process. And more recently, we worked out how to exploit Boyle's gas laws to make little pockets of artificial winter, which is all the refrigerator and freezer in your kitchen is really doing. It's exploiting scientific principles to make artificial winter to stop your food going off. Now, clearly, what's also been critical in our history is fire. We use fire to keep the cold at bay. We use fire to cook our food, again, to kill germs. And on a more fundamental level, our society, through the ages, has used fire to take the base stuff that we can dig out of the ground and transform it into the most useful materials and substances of history. We use fire to bake river mud, clay, into bricks that we use for building. We use fire to get metal out of the rocks. Now, despite how useful fire is to all of us, I don't think there's many people living in cities today that know the first things about how to actually make fire. I certainly don't know how to rub two sticks together to make them catch a light. And so one of the things I explored in the knowledge are some nifty post-apocalyptic survival hacks. How can you use weird and wonderful combinations of everyday items to start a fire if your life really depended on it? And the short video that I've got for you here now shows you how paradoxically you can start a fire using a fire alarm, using the very thing that we invented to warn us of a fire. Here it is. But perhaps most surprisingly, it can even use a fire alarm to start a fire with. And if we turn over the back of the fire alarm, take out the battery that it's got in there. This is a standard 9-volt battery with the two terminals, both at the same end. And we scavenge something like wire wool from any kitchen or supermarket. And if you take the terminals of the battery and just brush them against the steel wool, it will short circuit and heat up those very, very fine wires because they're very narrow and there's lots of resistance. So if we try that, you can really get a roaring fire started. Now what's absolutely amazing about that, that's not dry kindling or twigs catching alight. That is the metal itself bursting into flames. And what we've done there is exploit the scientific principle of electrical resistance. You take a very thin, narrow wire, you pass electricity through it with high resistance, and the wire gets very hot and bursts into flames. But if you can pull off that same trick of passing electricity through a very narrow wire and not have it burst into flames, you've just invented one of the most useful tools of the modern world. You've invented the light bulb. It was this process of trial and error and hacking that Thomas Edison had to go through to invent the first electric light bulb. And again, imagine just how different our everyday lives would be if you couldn't walk to the corner of the room, flick a switch, and have an artificial sun appear in the ceiling to light up our days for us. You'd have to go to bed every time the sun sets and woke up at dawn. We've exploited electricity to make a profitable, productive, everyday lives for ourselves. Now, one other aspect of a post-apocalyptic wasteland and trying to recover society as quickly as possible as you're rebooting is you'd want to prevent your society from sliding back and regressing to a state like this, where you've lost machinery, you've lost vehicles. You no longer can hop into the comfortable seat of your car, turn a key and be whisked down the motorway at 70 miles an hour. If you want something done, or if you want to move things around or grind up rocks, you have to resort again to using your own muscles or those of draft animals. And what we can see in this picture here, I think it's a very smug guy who's realised he's got a car, but he can't make it run anymore. He's run out of fossil fuels or petrol refined from them. He doesn't know how to make the spare parts to keep the engine running. So he's chopped in half this car, thrown away the useless front end, and kept the axles and the chassis of the rear and hitched it up to a horse to make some kind of post-apocalyptic Mad Max chariot. So the question is, how could you avoid resorting to this more primitive level of technology as we're recovering after an apocalypse? Well, it turns out that you can run machinery, you can run the internal combustion engine of a car not by using petrol or fossil fuels, but you can fuel it by using wood. And the process that you use for this is known as gasification. Now, one of the projects I was running when I was researching and writing this book, The Knowledge, was to build for myself what's known as a gasifier stove. It demonstrates the principle of how you can run a car using wood. And what I've got for this gasifier stove, this is the one that I made for myself. And all it is a large outer tin can with a smaller tin can that I've sighted in the top there, and it hangs down with a bunch of air holes that I've drilled in the bottom of that inner tin can. And to get your gasifier stove working, you fill it with a bit of newspaper, a bit of kindling, some wood, and you light that fuel. And because of the air holes at the bottom, you get a nice draft of air, of oxygen. And that's no different from any barbecue. But what is unique about this gasifier stove design is that there is a second row of air holes right at the top. So as the wood breaks down in the heat of its own fire, it gives off lots of gases and vapours and smoke, which is itself combustible. And you then reintroduce oxygen into that mix of hot gases, and it burns very, very efficiently. Now, I'm not about to demonstrate my gasifier stove sat inside here. So instead, I've got a short video for you of how this gasifier stove works. So let's get this fired up and see it working. I'll load it up with some simple kindling and tinder here, with just some newspaper and some dried twigs, which we push down in here. If I light the underneath with a lighter we've been able to scavenge, and while it smokes at the start, so we'll put slightly higher flue on it, and already that's roaring away with the air and the oxygen being drawn up. So to get that going nice and intensely, burning down that fuel. And if I take off this flue now, this is also called a rocket stove, perhaps for obvious reasons. If I take off that flue, if you come in here and look, you can see that upper ring of air holes. There are jets of flame coming out there where the oxygen is being drawn in and igniting all those producer gases coming off from the wood as it undergoes pyrolysis and gives off the vapour and the gas. And the smoke itself is combustible. So burning all of that is a very, very efficient way of using the fuel. So I reckon that's about ready for cooking. Put on my plate, and the custard that we opened earlier, and get some dinner on the go. This gasifier stove is a really good example of what's known as appropriate technology or intermediate technology. It's very easy to make yourself, and it's been taught around the developing world to people living in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where they would otherwise be cooking dinner in perhaps shanty towns over an open fire and breathing in all of that smoke. But instead, by building your own gasifier stove, not only is it much healthier because it's burning all of that smoke, it's a much, much more efficient and effective use of the firewood that you can collect. And what you can also do is scale up your gasifier stove from something the size of an old tin can. Scale it up to something the size of a dustbin, strap it to the back of a car, and you can run a vehicle, by using wood as fuel rather than diesel or petrol or the products of crude oil. On that back of the car there, that is the gasifier unit. The wood is being broken down under the heat of its own combustion, given off a lot of gases and vapours, which you then pipe over the roof of the car, down under the bonnet, under the hood, inject those gases into the engine cylinder, and only then allow those flammable gases to mix with oxygen and explode usefully to drive your car forward. Now, I will admit to you that this gasifier stove does look like some kind of crackpot, post-apocalyptic, steampunk, Mad Max contraption, but it works. It works perfectly well. And in fact, during the Second World War, with all of the fuel shortages across Europe, there were over 1 million gasifier-powered cars, wood-powered cars, driving along the roads of Europe, keeping civilized society running in the midst of this world war, of this localized apocalyptic situation. Now, in the long run, as your civilization is recovering and rebooting after this apocalypse, you're going to have to start finding things out for yourself. You're not going to be able to scavenge and forage what you need left lying around from the old dead cities. You're going to need to discover things for yourself, to make your own inventions. And one of the critical materials in our own history, in the beginnings of the scientific revolution, was a particular substance with a unique combination of properties. If you were trying to explore and investigate the natural world around you, you need tools to look at the world in different ways, to measure it for you, so you can spot patterns and come to understand how things work. So the tools of science are things like thermometers for measuring and understanding temperature, barometers for measuring and understanding pressure, or the telescope for seeing things very far away, or the microscope for seeing invisibly tiny things. Now, almost all of these scientific instruments, ways of exploring the world, all rely on the same substance with a unique combination of properties. And that is glass. There is no other material that you can make simply that is relatively strong, that is chemically unreactive. It doesn't interfere like a test tube might interfere with the chemical reactions you're trying to understand inside it, but is also completely transparent. Glass is the critical substance that you need to make the tools of science to understand the world around you. Now, it turns out that the three raw ingredients you need to put together and melt to make glass can all be collected from the same place, from a beach. You can get silica from the sand, you can get the sodium carbonate out of coastal plants like seaweed or other related species, and you can get the lime that you need from coral or seashells or chalk. And almost all the glass that we make today is this soda lime glass using those three simple raw ingredients. And I wanted to do this ultimate Robinson Crusoe experiment for myself. I wanted to go to a single beach, collect those three raw ingredients for myself, and make myself some glass from scratch in a weekend. Now, picture of a beach you see here, this is just one I found on Google Images. I didn't get to go to this beach for the experiment. Instead, I had to go to Norfolk in East England, where it pissed with rain for the entire weekend and was entirely miserable. But I was able to collect for myself the sand and the soda ash, the sodium carbonate from the coastal plants, and lime from the chalk, collected all those raw ingredients, ground them down, put them into a kiln, a box that you've made incredibly hot by using the transformative power of fire again, and I melted down all those raw ingredients and made for myself some Robinson Crusoe glass. And just to put my money where my mouth is, this is the glass that I made for myself. In principle, I could have taken this clear Robinson Crusoe glass and moulded it into a lens to have built a telescope or a microscope from scratch. And so that is the key process that you would need to go to if you were rebooting a civilization from scratch after an apocalypse and needing to rediscover and understand the natural world around you. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk to you guys about was, in the back of every book, there's always an author photograph, a portrait of the writer, probably looking pretty smug with themselves because they've just written an entire book. So it might be a photo, something like this. Well, I wanted the photograph on the back of the knowledge of this book to remain true to the premise of the book. I wanted to make a photograph from scratch myself. I wanted to take a selfie in the deepest, most profound sense you could ever take a selfie, by mixing together the very simple silver-containing chemistry, the light reactive chemistry, and creating my own self-portrait. So I went down to Laycock Abbey in the south of England, where photography was invented. And I worked with an historian of photography there to take my selfie, which you can see in this slide here. This is the most egotistical slide I'm going to show you in this entire talk, I swear to you. And so we mixed together this simple, primitive silver containing chemistry, spread that across a plate, loaded it into a primitive single lens camera, the sort of thing I could have made for myself with this Robinson Crusoe glass, and took my own photograph. Now, what you might notice about my selfie is I'm looking a little bit glum in this photo. I'm looking a little bit sour. And the reason for that is that this is no snapshot. This is a 16-second exposure. It takes a long while for that simple chemistry to respond and react to the light. And it is simply impossible over a 16-second exposure to hold a very natural-looking, smiling face without your facial muscles twitching or moving in the slightest, or for your shoulders to slump, because the slightest movement over 16 seconds and your entire face blurs into this ghostly apparition. So the only thing you can do is adopt a very neutral, passive, relaxed, unsmiling posture. And what you can't see is that behind me in this photo is a wrought iron skull clamp locked into the back of my head to hold my face absolutely stationary. And so that is why I'm looking a little bit glum in my selfie in this photo. And that's also the reason why all of our earliest photographs of our own ancestors, of Victorian ladies and gentlemen, they didn't not smile back in those days. They didn't know how to have a good time. They were all on the Lord and they were having a wild time back then. It is simply an artifact of the technology available at that period. It was impossible to capture a smile with a photograph. We are looking at our own ancestors through distorted lens or distorted chemistry, at any rate. Now, if any of this has been of interest to you, there's a book, The Knowledge, that you can pick up, but completely for free, you can go and explore the book's website, which is the-knowledge.org. There's plenty of the videos that you can watch on this website that we've seen short snippets of just now. There's lots of reading lists of the most interesting science and history books that dive down to this kind of idea, as well as novels and sci-fi that deals with this notion of going right back to basics and building things back up from scratch again. Books like Robinson Crusoe or The Swiss Family Robinson or The Martian, which is a much more recent book by Andy Weir and more recently a film with Matt Damon, which is basically this question but set on Mars. There's also some how-to guides on the website that explain to you, for example, about how you can build your own gasifier stove as a fun maker project you could perhaps do with your children in the back garden on a weekend, and start playing around with how things are made and done from scratch. Thank you ever so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the film festival.